You know the left has become unrecognizable when quoting Martin Luther King Jr., advocating for free speech, and warning about the predictions of socialist writer George Orwell are all seen as right-wing dog whistles. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be discussing what I call the shadow self of the left, which is basically the hypocrisy that we're seeing on the left-wing side of things, where the leftists are acting completely antithetically to the moral principles that they claim to espouse, such as tolerance, liberty, all of these kinds of things. I'm also going to talk about how liberalism has changed throughout the centuries and how it became what it is now, as well as the concerning creep towards authoritarianism and censorship that we're seeing, which I think is extremely important to talk about, and it's extremely important to be critical right now of left-wing politics and movements, given that they have such excessive influence on pretty much every major institution of our society right now when it comes to universities, Silicon Valley, social media, as well as pretty much claiming the sole ownership or stake when it comes to the ever-narrowing realm of socially acceptable public discourse. I'm going to talk about how the left moved away from working class interests and into this elitist kind of woke agenda, and what I think the left needs to do if it wants to regain faith within the American people. And to do all of that, we have to start with how the left has changed over the years. Part 1. A brief and oversimplified history of liberalism. The United States was founded on liberal ideas and principles, most of which still are kind of the core of all American people today, regardless of where on the political spectrum you fall under. The first notable change that happened, however, was the emphasis on free markets. Basically, a lot of recessions started occurring, and then especially once the 1930s Great Depression hit, we shifted towards Keynesian economics. FDR became president. He enforced a lot of kind of social welfare programs and work programs and so on. And basically the free market liberals started to label themselves as conservative, whereas modern liberals, as we know them today, started getting on board with the whole mixed economy and welfare state idea of the 1930s. That's why today, less economic regulation and a more laissez-faire form of capitalism is pretty much associated with the right, whereas, Bernie Sanders, social democracy, all of this kind of stuff is associated with the left. And then, in large part due to the Vietnam War, the left split again, with the kind of older, modern liberals sticking with working class interests and labor unions and so on, whereas the new left kind of emerged in opposition to the Vietnam War. The new left mostly took place on college campuses. It involved a lot of young intellectuals and so on, and it also had a lot of ties in with the 1960s hippie counter-revolutionary movement. And as a result of this, the new left stepped away from working class and economic issues and focused more on cultural issues and identity and so on, as well as the, identity of the entire nation. And this shift in the left away from working class concerns and into cultural and moral identity of the nation, mixed in with, of course, all of the pessimism following the Vietnam War, led the philosopher Richard Rorty in the 1990s to describe this left as spectatorial and theorizing, and that it basically gave up on pragmatic, hopeful, and progressive causes, and instead started to focus on the idea that the nation as a whole is irredeemable and that it can never really be a free and hopeful nation. In this book that I think he wrote in 1997, Achieving Our Country, he states, "Members of the spectatorial left find America unforgivable and unachievable, leading them to step back from their country and theorize it, and give cultural politics preference over real politics." This time period also corresponds with the rise of neo-Marxism and postmodern thought being taught excessively in universities, something that is still seen today. I know because I just graduated a couple years ago, with the full emphasis being on power dynamics and identity, with the overarching theme that America is a kind of a failed state. And while a lot of good definitely has come from this increased emphasis on race and gender and sexuality and whatnot within society, this is also, in the 1990s, kind of when the seeds of woke culture were first planted and began to take root. I'll share a quote with you later on that was written in the 90s that literally could have been written today, and it's pretty alarming. But skipping forward to the 2016 and 2020 Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, I do want to talk about that, because that was kind of a return to the old FDR-style, social democracy, welfare-style politics, the economic politics that the left had abandoned for a few decades. And there were obviously a lot of factors that contributed to Bernie Sanders running. I think a large one was the recent 2008 financial crisis. Pretty much when the economy is going good, people are like, yeah, free markets are pretty good. And then something happens like a recession and people are like, maybe we should have free healthcare and all these kinds of things. And that mixed along with the rising income inequality and college tuitions and how unaffordable life has gotten, it kind of really paved the way for a return to the old school economic style of left-wing politics, in my opinion. But the reason I want to talk about the Bernie Sanders campaign specifically is because I saw a change happen in between his two runnings, between 2016 and 2020, that really solidified for me the direction in which the left was going and kind of begins, at least in my opinion, it probably was already happening before, but the real solid kind of turning point in which woke politics completely took over the left, again in lieu of economic politics. This is also when I started noticing how regressive, elitist, and illiberal the left has become and is increasingly becoming. But even though I had experienced, the whole woke culture and all the trigger warnings and all of the politically correct language and getting canceled and all this kind of stuff in university, I feel like it really took hold of mainstream politics around 2018. This is when I noticed a lot of people online and a lot of my friends and a lot of my classmates started using this weird rhetoric of saying we don't want another white man president in regard to Bernie Sanders, even though they were Bernie or bust before then, and saying that if you don't vote for Elizabeth Warren instead of Bernie, it's because you're sexist, and all of this weird, absurdist nonsense. Like, okay, first of all, Bernie is a Jew. Does that not count for anything anymore? But it was also like, why would you be focused on these external characteristics, these superficial aspects of who someone is in terms of like what they look like or what's between their legs, when what matters is if their policies align with you and whether you think they would be a good president? Like, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. And obviously now that's how everything is, and people will explicitly say that they're going to hire someone based on their race or gender and so on, even within politics. And I feel like this concept really hit the mainstream left in the middle of the Bernie campaign. This is also in 2020 when AOC kind of backed out of endorsing Bernie because he retweeted Joe Rogan's endorsement of him. Basically because AOC doesn't agree with all of Joe Rogan's views, she thought it was wrong for Bernie to publicize that he endorsed him, even though like Joe Rogan is the most popular podcast host ever and his fan base is all across the political spectrum. It would be totally not pragmatic or practical to not politicize or just like emphasize that this person is supporting you and to go on their podcast and all of that. But what this really did, and this is a big deal among the left back in the day, but this moment really solidified for a lot of people how woke and elitist the left had become, where they care more about moral purity, absolute moral purity, over anything else. They don't actually want other people to be involved in their politics or other people to agree with what they say and their changes and so on. They just want people who have never made mistakes, who have nothing that disagrees with the party line or steps out of line with the party line, to be on their side. It's very insular, it's very like undemocratic really. I mean, it has nothing to do with the common man, it's the exact opposite, which I'll get into later. But it really showed that the left does not care about the average person or especially the working class, and it really just became this weird woke kind of religious sort of thing. And what I think is interesting is even the socialist magazine Jacobin recognized that this woke politics wasn't getting them anywhere and it was super divisive and so on. They had a really good article called Why Everyone Hates Democrats that I was reading in research for my War on Moderates video, which if you haven't seen, you should check out. But I would like to share two brief passages from this article. The first one states, according to a report from the Democratic Fund Voters Study Group, Democratic-leaning working class voters ranked their top 5 issues as follows: healthcare, Social Security, Medicare, the economy, and jobs. But liberal professionals listed theirs as environment, climate change, healthcare, education, and racial equality. By comparing rankings, we can see great chasms between groups. While crime was listed 6th for workers, professionals' concerns about crime placed way down in position 17. And while workers listed the economy as their number 4 concern, professionals saw it as 12th in line. For professionals, climate change was a top issue in this election. For workers, it didn't even break the top 10. And the other passage states, progressives and socialists are now pairing ambitious and urgently necessary proposals like Medicare for all with wildly unpopular and sometimes counterproductive policy positions. Further, progressives have embraced a racialized worldview that reduces whole populations to their skin color. Woke ideology has prevented many on the left from grasping the possibility that a Mexican American may care more about healthcare than immigration, that women might be more motivated by economic promises than electing a first female president, or that Trump might be able to improve his vote share among the working class black voters. And I'm glad that this article exists because I feel like it really validates the points that I made. But it's like, yeah, the left doesn't care about the working class, that's clear. The interests are completely out of line. and it's elitist. And also this woke ideology, it tokenizes minorities, which I'll get into in the equality section, but it also just shows how shallow a worldview these woke people have of the world and how out of touch they are with the working class and the common person. Like, and then they complain and they wonder and they just scratch their heads over how Donald Trump became president. Like, I'm not going to get into it. I'm not going to get too heated, okay? I probably will later on in the video though. But basically this woke ideology that we see right now taking over the left and all of our institutions and our government was birthed in the moral matrix of a small elite group of progressives beginning back in the 1990s, and it's fully manifested to today. And that brings me on to my main criticism of the left within this video, which is going to be the shadow self of the left. So somebody's shadow self is a term coined by the psychologist Carl Jung. It's basically the parts of ourselves that we repress and that we project onto others and criticize in others and neglect within ourselves in order to retain our sense of ourselves as good and pure people. Jung also focuses a lot on the split personality of the self, or the split consciousness of the self, and how this manifests in the physical and political world. If you haven't read The Undiscovered Self, I definitely recommend it. So moving forward in this video, I want to explore the hypocrisies within the left right now by analyzing what they claim their core tenets and morals to be, namely tolerance, progress, equality, and democracy, and how they are acting completely antithetically to those values. And so if you're interested in that, I guess just keep on watching, because that's starting right now, beginning with tolerance. We all know the type of liberal who will put a coexist bumper sticker on their Prius but will literally estrange from their own parents because they watch Fox News, but the tolerance issue on the left is actually much bigger than that. Tolerance has long been seen not only as a left-wing value, but a value inherent to democracy in itself. One of the results of the French Revolution was an article in the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen stating, "No one shall be interfered with for his opinions, even religious ones, provided that their practice does not disturb public order as established by the law." And before that, of course, it was a major theme in the Declaration of Independence, and before that, the Enlightenment. But I bring up the French Revolution because that's where our notions of left-wing and right-wing come from. Tolerance, by definition, means allowing people who you vehemently disagree with or even hate to be able to express their opinions, so long as they're not infringing on the rights of anyone else. These days, however, it seems like the scope of acceptable opinion and discourse is constantly shrinking. We see this most notably on social media and in university campuses, but it's definitely spilling over into the public at large and even underneath supposedly democratic governments, which I'll get into later in the democracy section of this video. I also see the left constantly employing salami tactics, which are cutting off every branch of political dissent separate of yours until only your true faction is being seen as legitimate. The more extreme you get on one side or another, the less you see political dissidents or opponents as allies or worthy of debate and discussion, and the more prone you are to violence and censorship. By calling everyone who disagrees with any of their opinions racist, sexist, homophobic, etc., the left is not only pushing very many people out of their movement, it's also constantly narrowing its own scope and eating itself, basically, because if you say one thing that they don't agree with, all of a sudden you're out. And we saw this elitism and moral puritanism earlier with AOC's reaction to the Bernie Sanders endorsement, but it's also a major component of cancel culture, which of course is largely associated with the left. But this idea of demonizing ever-expanding political groups outside of your own is nothing new. Back in 1944, George Orwell said that the word fascist had lost all meaning, and it just became a synonym for people you don't like or people who you don't agree with. And a quote this also reminds me of was from a Medium article that I read one time about someone, leaving the left or whatever, and she said, "SJWs don't have friends, they have allies, and allies leave you as soon as you're not speaking the ideology anymore." And I feel like this is just really apt when it comes to what I see the most extreme and woke sections of the left doing. And it's honestly very bad for their political cause. And while both sides of the political spectrum can be censorial and repressive, I feel like it's especially ironic coming from the left because they do pride themselves on being the tolerant party. But again, one of the worst things that I always talk about on my channel when it comes to this kind of walking on eggshells feeling we all have when it comes to political discourse is the self-censorship aspect. In a study on the political climate of the University of North Carolina's campus, it was found that conservative and independent students self-censor far more than liberal students, fear retribution from teachers for their political views, and are more likely to be friends with people with different political views than vice versa. To read a summary quote from this study, it states, Also troubling were the undergraduates who reported having kept an opinion to themselves in the classroom, even though the opinion was related to the class, because they were worried about the potential consequences of expressing it. Almost 68% of conservatives censored themselves in this way, along with roughly 49% of moderates and 24% of liberals. Expressing unpopular views can reveal critical blind spots in prevailing thought patterns, the author of the report note, and even when a view is wrong, its refutation allows both parties to better apprehend why the correct view must be true. But a substantial proportion of respondents fear social sanction, or even outright grading penalties for sharing their views. What's more, almost a quarter of conservative students reported being more than slightly concerned that peers would file a complaint against them for speech related to a class they are in together. Conservatives on campus also harbor significantly less negative stereotypes of their opposite political party than vice versa, and these findings are reflected in society at large, with staunch liberals being the main political group that feels they can express their political opinions, as well as being most likely to block others due to their political opinions. And this is damaging not just to political discourse as a whole, but even within liberal and left-wing political discussions and ideas, as Carl Jung states in regards to the shadow. To make oneself understood is certainly impossible without far-reaching comprehension of the other's standpoint. Being unwilling to understand opposite viewpoints not only cuts you off from understanding your peers, but it also cuts you off from understanding your own viewpoints as well, because you really can only understand yourself in relation to others and their ideas, and you can only really find truth through rigorous reason and discourse. And if you're blocking off people's opinions because they're offensive to you or you don't like them, how are you going to improve anything? Censoring dissident also makes your arguments look weaker because it makes it seem like you think that if someone challenged your beliefs, they would win because your beliefs can't hold up the test of time in terms of the marketplace of ideas or whatever, and that any challenge to your beliefs will prove them to be wrong. But if what you think is really true, you should be able to argue on behalf of that and win, basically. Even if maybe you're not the best arguer, over time, your ideas will reach fruition, regardless and actually because of challenges from other sides. There are also oftentimes small truths hidden within bigger lies, and through rigorous debate and discourse, we're able to uncover those truths while getting rid of the falsehoods, but these days the left seems antagonistic to that concept. And finally, censoring political opponents means that you think your ideas, no matter how extreme they are infallible, and this is basically the viewpoint of dictators and authoritarians, the idea that you are right about everything, and no one else is allowed to challenge you. And the next value that the left claims to be near and dear to their hearts that I want to analyze is the concept of equality, particularly as it relates to gender, race, and sexuality. The fight for equality before the law and of opportunity has obviously been long and arduous among many different identity groups and political factions, and has overall been noble in its gains and goals. And while progress has been widely substantial in this field, particularly within Western democracies, there is still more that needs to be done. One of the most unfortunate and regressive aspects of this new woke ideology taking over leftist political discourse, however, is the constant stereotyping and tokenization of minorities. The emphasis is no longer to treat people as individuals irrespective of their identity group, but rather to treat people as members of their identity group irrespective of their individuality. And like I said, this cultural politics in the left was visible in its infancy decades ago, which is why I want to read to you this quote from the 90s that very well could have been written today. It's from 1999. The article is called "Cracking the Speech Code." And the article basically chronicles the outrage by students and professors when administration tried to implement speech codes in order to keep minority students safe from harmful language. Even though one of the big victories of the new left in the 60s was allowing free speech on campus through the free speech movement, the culture wars later on caused a lot of liberal administrators to try and restrict speech that they don't like. Basically, as soon as a political party gains power in any establishment, they abuse it, tale as old as time. And now we see woke students join alongside administration to try and ban people from campus, but more on that later. Anyways, the quote is, "To Shepard, this incident signaled how the small number of leaders is so out of touch with actual minority students. In his words, there is a handful of self-appointed leftist activists who claim the right to speak for every minority on this campus. Far from being representative of those minorities, these activists are some of the most authoritarian, oppressive people I've ever met. They try to intimidate a campus and chill debate. Anyone who challenges their views is called sexist, racist, or homophobic," he says. Although they claim to be fighting for equality and freedom for minority students, he concludes, they silence any opposition within their minority group. Shepard saw the issue in straightforward terms. "It makes me cringe to defend bigots," he says, "but that's part of what defending the First Amendment is all about." And this concept of self-appointed leftist activists speaking on behalf of every minority student and silencing dissent within their own identity groups, I feel like has reached full fruition today. There seems to be this widespread belief that anyone who isn't a straight white male has to be a Democrat or a leftist and has to view themselves as victims, have the same opinions on everything, vote in the same way. They have to be offended by all the same things and hold all of the same values, completely neglecting the fact that people are different and these external characteristics really don't reflect that much about who we are, not as much as these leftists claim they do in terms of race and gender and so on. And then of course, if you step out of the party line, they call you a coon or an Uncle Tom, or they claim you have internalized misogyny or internalized transphobia. The internalized stuff is my favorite because apparently your issues are so deep that you can't even recognize them, and therefore you can't defend yourself or prove otherwise. They basically just gotta throw a label on you and you have no way of defending yourself. In response to this kind of media narrative that everyone of a certain race or gender or sexuality all have to think the same way, there's even a website called Free Black Thought, which is dedicated to amplifying Black voices that are left out of the mainstream because media and society at large seem to have decided that only woke left activists are the allowed political opinion of any minority group whatsoever. We also saw this tokenization of minorities hit the mainstream left during Joe Biden's presidential campaign, where he promised to elect a female vice president and to nominate a Black woman to the Supreme Court before he had even begun the recruitment or hiring process or had even begun looking at prospects. And obviously there's nothing wrong with having a Black woman in power or a woman in general in power. That's obviously not what this is about. The problem is that he looked at an identity group before the actual qualifications or competence. When he said that thing about the vice president being female, I remember watching that on TV and being so offended because I'm like, your job as a president is to do what's best for this country. If there is someone who happens to be more qualified and a better suit for the position, but he's male, you're really gonna choose a woman over him just because she has different genitalia? Like, that's really what you're gonna do as president? And then when it came to the Black woman thing, what's upsetting about it, and recently he did nominate a Black woman to the Supreme Court. And again, this is not me sharing my opinion on any of these politicians or anything like that, but the thing about Ketanji Jackson is that it doesn't even matter how qualified she is anymore. She will only ever be seen as a diversity hire because that's explicitly what she was. That came before any other qualification. If he just happened to nominate someone who is a Black woman, that would be one thing, that would be fine. But it's the fact that he explicitly prioritized that over anything else. Before he had even had a pool of applicants, he was just like, it will be a Black woman. Like, how is this okay? Like, how is this not the opposite of what Martin Luther King fought for when he said people should be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin? Which is why Martin Luther King is now seen as a right-wing dog whistle whenever you bring him up, because apparently discrimination is good. But yeah, I understand conversations around like affirmative action and whatnot are very controversial, but it's just the blatant tokenization. It's so blatant. Like, only hiring someone first and foremost because of their race and gender. Like, it just seems so regressive to me. And there are, unfortunately, a lot of woke activists who label themselves as anti-racist, who are literally the most racist people you come across in everyday life, which is unfortunate, and there's always the constant coddling and infantilization of minorities. I guess it's called the white liberal savior complex or whatever, where basically white liberals feel like they have to speak on behalf of everyone else, like they somehow hold the one true opinion and they understand the one true feeling that everybody of any minority group has. It's just all so ridiculous, and it's so hypocritical, and it's not just cringy, but it's just dehumanizing. But moving on to one of the most nefarious aspects of the whole equality thing that we're seeing on the left is the equity discourse. And if you don't know what equity is, it basically means equality of outcome versus equality, which is equality of opportunity. Equality, as an example, means each individual is able to apply for a job, whereas equity would be making sure the people who are hired numerically represent a certain quota, whether it's based on race or gender, etc. As an example, if a company valued racial equity and 100 people applied to their job, they might hire based on having exactly 25% Black, 25% Asian, 25% Latino, and 25% white representation in their workforce, rather than hiring solely based on qualification, because that obviously doesn't guarantee that there will be an exact ratio, which is what they're looking for. And this idea is usually brought up when it comes to economic outcome, and it's usually touted by kind of the pro-Marxist leftists, as you would expect, and it's very clearly linked to communism if you think it through for a little bit. It requires a very powerful state to make sure all outcomes are equal, irrespective, or I guess not irrespective, but specifically based on identity group.
You cannot win if you play identity politics. There's a bunch of reasons. Like, here's one. Let's push for equality of outcome. All right? Who measures it? That's a big problem. It's not a little problem. It's not like we'll figure that out later. Oh, no, no, no. The measurement problem is paramount. So you don't solve that, you don't solve the problem at all. Who measures it? A bureaucracy. Okay, which bureaucracy? Well, a large one that has its fingers everywhere. Okay, that's problem number one. And it's staffed by exactly the sort of people that you don't want to staff it, by the way. Next problem. Which identities? That's the intersectional problem, right? The radical leftists have already hit the problem of intersectionality. It's like, well, we've got race and gender, let's say. Well, okay, what about the intersection between race and gender? That's a multiplicative intersection, right? So you might start with 3 racial categories and 2 gender categories, but you end up with 6 intersectional categories, and then you're just getting started. How many genders? Hypothetically, there's an infinite number. What about racial groupings? You're going to include ethnicity? You want to add class to that? You want to add socioeconomic class? How about attractiveness? And every time you add another category to the singular entities, you increase the multiplicative entities in a multiplicative fashion. What are you going to do? You're going to equate across all those categories? Really? And across what dimensions? What are the dimensions of equality that you want to establish? It's just socioeconomic. Is it just salary? What about all the other ways that people are unequal? You're going to just stop with economic inequality, are you? It's like, it's a complete bloody catastrophe. It's an absolute mess. And intersectionality, the discovery of intersectionality on the left is actually the radical left's discovery of the fundamental flaw in their identity politics ideology. Groups can be multiplied without limit. Okay, that's not a problem. That's a fatal flaw.
Trying to control the equality of outcome is not only impossible and also one of the most authoritarian things you could do in a society, but it also completely stifles creativity, innovation, individuality. Everyone instead, it's anti-freedom. Like, if what you put in doesn't equate to the benefits that you receive, instead the benefits are spread across evenly regardless of what you do, really, what is even the point of doing anything? Like, I don't understand. It's fine. I know it's a lot more complicated than that, and if you have any insight, feel free to comment it down below. I am going to move on because there's a lot to get to in this video. I feel like at the very beginning, identity politics was about ensuring equal opportunity and making sure everyone had rights, basic human rights, but it's since predated on our basic feelings of empathy and justice in order to enact widespread bureaucracy, infantilization of minorities, tokenization, equality of outcome, and as a way to increase division among a wide faction of identity groups. I feel like the whole thing is very nefarious, and I guess that kind of leads me into my next section, which is on progress. With the rise in more radical and Marxist influence on the left, we see progress no longer as making marked improvements upon the present towards an unforeseeable but improved upon future, and rather, as in the case of equity, enacting widespread policy change or revolution towards a finite and absolute end goal of a future. But the fact of the matter is, history can never be completed. Even when it comes to something as small as policy change, there can always be a paradigm shift or a moment in which the environment has changed so much that policy is no longer effective and it becomes outdated and needs to be changed. Or it can even be harmful and needs to be changed. And by keeping the future an open book, we're able to remain adaptable to these changes and continually progress from where we are marginally towards something better. But one of the big problems with this whole communism, Marxist-Leninism thing is that it asserts that there's an end goal that can be achieved in which a utopia will come about and no further changes, at least on the larger structural level, need to be made. But we all know that this is impossible and there can never be some perfect ending because history is always in flux and evolving. Completely revolutionizing America and replacing what we have now, a mixed economy, with communism is not going to solve all of our problems. And the problem with utopia and viewing this sort of end goal as bringing about utopia and whatnot is that it pretty much necessarily entails the phrase, the ends justify the means, which is why we see such tyrannical oppression and dictatorships in all of these countries that have tried the communist experiment over and over and over again. The other thing that effective progress and improvement requires is some kind of faith that progress is possible. There has to be some element of national pride within a country in order to even have any will towards changing things, to have any faith that your country can be better, to have any heart in actually improving it. Richard Rorty in Achieving Our Country, like I mentioned, talks about how this post-Vietnam War left, mixed with changes in higher education, has led the left to believe that America is irredeemable. Having been birthed and drenched in sin, it can never be achieved in any sort of hopeful manner, and that's why we have to completely overthrow it. And to quote from that book, he states, "The narrative about our country from the left is that it is irredeemable. Therefore, the only solution is to tear down and rebuild in their image. We are no longer the party of hope, but of destruction." Adding on to this, Eric Hoffer wrote back in the 1940s on the nature of mass movements that, by expatiating upon the incurable baseness and vileness of the times, the frustrated softened their feeling of failure and isolation. It is as if they said, "Not only our blemished selves, but the lives of all our contemporaries, even the most happy and successful, are worthless and wasted." Thus, by deprecating the present, they acquire a vague sense of equality. Even despite all of the change and progress our country has made in terms of being a more equal and democratic society, the left, for some reason, still holds on to this notion that all of our history is completely evil, that we can never be anything great, that America needs to be destroyed. And, I mean, yeah, again, it kind of makes sense why we had such a backlash with the whole Make America Great Again and everything, because patriotism is basically dead in our country. And obviously we shouldn't be boisterous and extremely nationalist and blind to our own problems and hypocrisies and so on. But at the same time, you can't just completely get rid of all faith or hope in your country, because then you become completely disaffected from the outcome of our nation. But to me, when it comes to this idea that everybody's life is ruined and wanting everyone to be equally oppressed because then at least we're equal, this reminds me a lot of the Marxist-Leninist discourse I see online, which I wish I'm not that involved in that side of things. It's just that I went to college and I grew up in California, and I'm also on the internet, and a lot of this rhetoric is used very constantly on the left. But we've turned towards emphasizing theory and revolution rather than actually focusing on pragmatic steps to make lives better for all Americans, or even all people, but particularly the working class. And that's extremely upsetting to me. But stepping away from the Marxist stuff for a second, there are also, of course, a lot of ways in which the left is being extremely regressive and hypocritical when it comes to more traditional liberal notions of progress. A little while back here on YouTube, the New York Times opinions section posted a video called "How Liberal Hypocrisy is Fueling American Inequality" by Johnny Harris, and I'll link that down below. And pretty much everyone who watched it, myself included, was extremely surprised that the New York Times published it, because it seems recently they've completely given up on objective journalism and have just become an echo chamber, particularly since the rise of Trump. But this video that they posted actually was critical of the left and highlights a few major hypocrisies when it comes to liberal cities and how they're acting antithetically to their values, while at the same time blaming Republicans for all of their problems. So here's a brief section of that video on housing.
So everything on this map that is yellow is zoned for single-family homes, like this and this. One family can live here. But here in Palo Alto, there are a lot of new jobs. This is a desirable place to live for new opportunities. Over the past 8 years, the San Francisco area has added 676,000 jobs, but only 176,000 housing units. So a few years ago, the city council voted to change the zoning of one section of the city right here. Specifically this 2-acre plot of land. They wanted to change it from low-density housing to higher density housing so that they could build a 60-unit affordable housing complex for elderly members of the community. Okay, so they changed the zoning. Start building the 60-unit complex. No, the overwhelmingly liberal residents of Palo Alto decided to hold a vote to overturn the decision, to revert it back to low-density, single-family housing, back to yellow. And it passed, and the zoning was overturned. So now when you go to this plot of land, instead of an affordable housing complex for the elderly, what you're gonna see is this: a row of just a few houses, all of them massive and worth around $5 million each.
I think people aren't living their values. You go to these meetings in these neighborhoods where they're talking about a new housing project, and it's always the same song, and it goes like this: I am very in favor of affordable housing. We need more of it in this community. However, I have some concerns about this project.
This is happening all over California.
Liberals claim to want affordable housing, yet vote against it in the most liberal sectors, and then they have the nerve to complain about about homelessness and a lack of diversity. I mean, Silicon Valley is like kind of the most left-wing area of California you can get, and we have Hollywood here, you know? And yet this is still the outcome. And as I talk about in my War on Moderates video, what's really annoying about living in California here is how they're able to evade absolutely any and all criticism by simply blaming everything on the Proud Boys and insurrectionists and these Republicans who are taking over our nation. It's like, dude, like sometimes it's you. Like you could be the issue too. Have you ever thought of that?
What we're talking about here is that blue states are the problem. Blue states are where the housing crisis is located. Blue states are where the disparities in education funding are the most dramatic. Blue states are the places where tens of thousands of homeless people are living on the streets. Blue states are the places where economic inequality is increasing most quickly in this country. This is not a problem of not doing well enough. It is a situation where the blue states are the problem.
Affluent liberals tend to be really good at showing up to the marches and talking about how they love equality. They're really good at putting signs in their lawns saying that all are welcome here. But by their actions, what they're actually saying is, yes, we believe in these ideals, just not in my backyard.
We are not living our values. People who live in blue states, people who profess liberal values, you need to look in the mirror. And need to understand that they are not taking the actions that are consistent with those values, not just incidentally, not just in small areas, but that some of the most important policy choices. We are denying people the opportunity to prosper and to thrive and to build better lives, and it is happening in places where Democrats control the levers of policy.
And of course, as I touched on earlier, the left has become very regressive when it comes to free speech, which is something that I am the most concerned about. If you've been on my channel by now, hopefully it's not too annoying. I'm always talking about free speech, but it's kind of the most important and fundamental right we have and our best tool for resisting tyranny and authoritarianism. But basically, the free speech movement of the 60s was widely considered one of the kind of great accomplishments of the New Left. It allowed political speech to be allowed on campus by anyone. This is a big deal when people who were protesting against the war were constantly being reprimanded.
Some of the organizations that had been affected by this set up a picket line. Civil rights people, Goldwater Republicans, Ayn Rand objectivists. It had put democracy above ideology.
And that applies to all students and for all political speech, which is why it's extremely concerning that 50 years later, we literally have physical violence coming about upon campuses and fires being started and whatnot to disinvite speakers who students don't like or whose views they hold to be offensive. It's also depressing how much of a chilling effect this has had on students, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of what they feel like they're allowed to say in the classroom and on campus. And this is having far-reaching consequences. I mean, we're seeing it all over. And the censorship of free speech and political dissent should be something that concerns absolutely everyone, but because the left holds a majority power right now, it's like they just don't even care because censoring speech benefits them. They're completely foregoing all morality and integrity in order to get these cheap gains that may eventually lead into really long-lasting, terrible gains, for everybody else at least. And finally, the onus of convincing others of a new belief is on the person expressing said belief. Leftists are constantly changing things and expecting everyone to get on board without any proof or reasoning as to why. And as the party of change, communication and education is paramount to the success of that political party. But instead, they've chosen the social shaming and authoritarian censorship approach, which is why there's just been so much backlash, or at least one of the major reasons why. But then to end the progress section, I will use my very last Richard Rorty quote that I have up in this video, and that is this one. The concern to do what the 60s called naming the system takes precedence over reforming the laws. The system is sometimes identified as late capitalism, but the cultural left does not think much about what the alternatives to a market economy might be, or about how to combine political freedom with centralized economic decision-making. Nor does it spend much time asking whether Americans are undertaxed or how much of a welfare state the country can afford, or whether the United States should back out of NAFTA. When the right proclaims that socialism has failed and that capitalism is the only alternative, the cultural left has little to say in reply, for it prefers not to talk about money. And for my final section here on the shadow self of the left, I want to talk about democracy and anti-authoritarianism and how the left is kind of turning against these espoused values. Democracy and anti-authoritarianism. The worst part of advocating for free speech is advocating for people who, if they could, would deny those same rights to you, Also, of course, defending bigots or people who you find abhorrent. This is the least favorite part of pretty much every constitutional lawyer's job, I would imagine. But they know, and anyone with any historical knowledge knows, limiting free speech for some, particularly under such broad and subjective brushes as hate speech, will eventually come back to suppress your speech or those of your family members and so on, so long as you are no longer in the majority. Giving a state this much power over what you are and are not allowed to express is just a bad idea. Like, it will come back to bite you. The Bill of Rights is intended to protect the minority at any given time. You don't need a Bill of Rights to protect the majority in a democracy because the vote already does that. But to me, it seems like the left has gotten way too comfortable when it comes to allowing their governments to enact despotic rule over what people are and are not allowed to say or do, so long as it aligns with left-wing political values or the left in regards to the culture war. To quote Jung, "Free opinion is stifled and moral decision ruthlessly suppressed on the plea that the end justifies the means, even the vilest." A recent stunning example of this was Justin Trudeau's declaration of a state of emergency in Canada in order to silence protesters in terms of the country's health mandates. The Canadian trucker story, if you guys have been keeping up with that. Protesters had their bank accounts frozen so they couldn't buy food or gasoline, and anyone who donated to them had their donations refunded, although GoFundMe originally tried to redistribute their donations to other charities that the donators didn't ask for, which is literally theft. But instead, due to backlash, they refunded the people. But people who were involved in the protest or associated with protesters literally had their bank accounts frozen. Like, talk about a government trying to starve out dissent, you know what I mean? And you could tell this sort of audacity when it comes to censorship is kind of new because this state of emergency hadn't been used in decades. But all of a sudden, in response to mostly peaceful protests, the government, with the support of very many liberals, decided to literally silence protesters, political dissent, the minority, just because they didn't agree with it. Can you even imagine if the United States or Canada did this in response to the BLM protesters back in 2020? Can you imagine if anyone involved in those protests had their entire bank accounts frozen and couldn't buy food or anything like that? And anyone who donated to the organization or to protesters or people who were arrested or anything like that, literally, like, those donations didn't even go through? Like, there would be so much more outroar and outrage about it, but the fact that it mostly was targeted around a conservative movement, this just didn't happen. And that just shows how as soon as one faction, one political faction gains majority within a culture war or within politics, they immediately abuse it. And it's really upsetting that people don't understand that when you allow a government to do this, it will come back to bite you as soon as you're the person in the minority. And I feel like, at least if you're a thinking person, we've all had, views that align with the majority and views that don't. Imagine your views that don't get you, canceled in the sense of literally not being able to pay rent. When you literally didn't break any laws, you did nothing criminal. And this freezing of accounts, while absolutely batshit insane, is actually not new. I will link a video down below by Glenn Greenwald. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know I always reference Glenn Greenwald, called Banishment from the Financial System, War on Dissent, where he kind of chronicles this new tactic by the government of freezing bank accounts or pressuring private banks and whatnot to freeze people's bank accounts in response to political ideas that they don't like. He starts from WikiLeaks and how this happened to WikiLeaks when they exposed basically the Obama administration for egregious offenses, and they didn't like that. And he takes it all the way up to the trucker incident. So again, maybe check out that video if you're more interested. But moving on, it's just extremely concerning to me how little people understand in terms of how fragile our democracy is and how constant our rights need defending. People, I feel like, especially if you just grew up here, you're like, oh yeah, I have these basic human rights that, a lot of people in other countries don't have, but that we have, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the government is allowed to tell me who to worship or what to say. But then it's like, they don't realize that you constantly have to defend these things, because when it comes to power, people in power will do whatever they can to diminish your human liberties. Power is intoxicating, and people who have it want more, and that includes governments and bureaucracies and the state and so on. But the weird thing about the left is that it holds on to the morality and the moral identity of being the underdogs, even as they are quickly becoming the most potent and powerful political faction in our country. And unfortunately, just as you would expect, they've ultimately proven to be power-hungry and authoritarian, exemplified particularly by their attempts to stall free speech and political dissent, And unfortunately, this only seems to be getting worse every single year. And this is obviously not to say that the right doesn't ever try to censor speech or get rid of separation of church and state or anything like that. Obviously, there's issues on both sides. But again, this video is just about the left because that's what I have more experience in and so on. But to conclude this video, because it does have to come to an end, even though I could rant about all these things for so long, something unfortunate about, making a video that's as broad as this one is I can't necessarily go completely in depth into every section. It's kind of just an overview for now. But in terms of the direction I feel like we need to go in politics, I'm not going to say anything too specific, but I do think we really need to break out of our tribal nature and really work together to build a more cohesive and free country and free society. And to quote Jung again, because I'm really, trying to tie this whole broad general video in with the whole shadow self concept, he states, "The doctor has to establish a relationship with both halves of the patient's personality, because only from them both, and not merely from one half with the suppression of the other, can he put together a whole and complete man." And as I stated in my War on Moderates video, the increased income inequality, the increases in tuition and gas prices and inflation, and the way things are going right now with life becoming more and more unaffordable, I feel like we're really getting primed for a sort of revolution that is not necessarily going to be good, fruitful, or pretty. And if we don't find bipartisan solutions to problems like the homelessness epidemic, opioid epidemic, the fact that we're basically living in another Gilded Age, and what are we going to do about this? Healthcare isn't affordable for a lot of people. Like, these are actual problems that need to be solved, but everyone's so polarized and radical that it seems like we've given up on solving them. We just blame each other for everything, and I'm just very concerned about where the future is going, and I feel like changes need to be made, which is very broad, but I feel like revolutionary sentiment is bubbling up and over, and I feel like if we don't figure out how to make things better, there could be a lot of widespread violence, and we could end up with a regime that is even more totalitarian and authoritative than the one that we have now. Because the one we have now is actually not that bad. There's a lot of bad things going on, obviously, but comparatively in terms of history, we could have it a lot worse. And if we don't figure out solutions together, it could be a lot worse very, very soon. And another concerning thing that I think we're all seeing, whether you're on the right or the left, is just a lot of people giving into mob mentality and mob rule. And I think that this is getting worse, not just because of social media, but because of all of those things I mentioned earlier. People are extremely frustrated. There's a lot of things that have been going on over the past few years, and there's a lot of things going on in the world right now, and there's a lot of trends that are not necessarily positive trends that people feel very disaffected. They're frustrated, they're angry, they can't afford life. Frustrated people easily end up in mob rule and mob mentality, and it can be very destructive. And to quote Jung once more, because I think this is maybe one of the best quotes that he's had, or at least it's the best quote that I've included within this video because I think it's extremely important. He states, "Resistance to the organized mass can be effected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself." If you're like most people, there are going to be some opinions and values that you have that are held by the majority and other ones that are not. And it's important to be honest throughout your life and really be critical and question everything. So that way, when you do stand for something, you know that it's something that you actually believe, not something that was just told to you by family, friends, the internet, mob mentality, all of that. Because that's the only way to effectuate actual, authentic, and integral change versus, easily falling for something that could end up being regressive and violent. And I know this is easier said than done, and obviously people change their minds about things all the time, which is generally a good thing. And I think it's also important to be really open-minded and kind to yourself when it comes to changing political views or perspectives within yourself and opening up your mind to other people's experiences and so on, because the fact of the matter is life is in flux. It's not rigid, it's not determined. We never know what the future is going to be, and you just have to really understand yourself and your values and your priorities independent of people around you before you're really able to kind of integrate politically within society in a way where you can actually be true to your beliefs while affecting positive change in others. But that's just my 2 cents. Obviously, I don't know anything. Okay, I'm just a bitch on the internet with opinions. But I'm going to end that here. I don't think I'm going to make a video again specifically about politics, at least not for a while. I would like to add some more lightheartedness back to my channel. And also, I'm not a political expert. If this video gets any substantial amount of views. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be upset about a lot of the things that they said, have different opinions, which is obviously fine and always welcome. But yeah, these are just my thoughts on this. Like I said, I've been wanting to make this video for well over a year now because I've just had a lot of thoughts on where the left has been and where it's been going. And I'm just a concerned citizen, so that's that. If you're subscribed to my channel, thank you. It means I'll see you in my next upload. And with that being said, like and subscribe, all that YouTube stuff, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.